The tray was too heavy for hands that had not slept. 8 cups. 6 saucers with the good gilt rim, 2 with the plain, because Aunt Maurice had counted wrong on purpose and would blame Rena for the mismatch before the hour was out. 12 steps across the parlor. A duke at the far end of the room, seated with the still attention of a man used to being watched. Rena had a count of perhaps 40 seconds before her stepmother's smile turned into a look, and the look turned into a sentence, and the sentence rearranged the rest of her life. Do not spill. Do not lift the eyes. Do not, whatever else, let the porcelain rattle. The porcelain rattled. It was a small sound, no louder than a coin dropped on a book, but in a room arranged to hear nothing except the murmuring of an engagement, it carried like a struck bell. Rena felt the heat climb her throat and stop, obedient, at the collar of the borrowed dress. She kept walking. The betrothal had been announced 20 minutes earlier, in the drawing room downstairs, with the appropriate number of witnesses and the appropriate absence of feeling. Her stepsister Ilva had received the news with the practiced grace of someone who had understood since she was 10 years old that her purpose in the world was to say yes gracefully to a suitable man, and this suitor was more than suitable. He was a coup. Or he would have been, had anyone in Maurice's household understood who exactly had just crossed their threshold. They believed the Duke was the elder cousin, the one with the good estate outside the capital and the pliable temperament. He was not. The name was the same. The face was not. Rena, who had spent 7 years reading the household's correspondence because Maurice could not be bothered and Ilva could not be trusted, knew this in the way one knows the difference between 2 brothers by the sound of their footsteps in a corridor. She had known it the moment he stepped through the door and inclined his head half an inch too little, and she had said nothing. Because she had learned very early that a woman who corrects her stepmother in company is a woman who does not eat that evening. So there was a duke in the parlor, just not the one they thought, and someone was going to have to pour him tea. The someone was her, because Ilva's hands were required for holding a bouquet of hothouse lilies that had cost more than a season of firewood, and because Maurice considered pouring beneath her, and because the housemaid Petra had been sent, for reasons no one had explained, to polish silver in a room where no silver required polishing. Rena reached the low table. She set the tray down. She lifted the pot. The porcelain was thin enough that she could feel the tea moving inside it, a small tide answering her pulse. She did not look at the Duke. She looked at the cup. She poured. She had poured tea 5,000 times if she had poured it once, in every mood and every weather, for guests who mattered and guests who did not, and never, not in all those 1,000 pourings, had the stream from the spout betrayed her. It did not betray her now. But her hand did. It was the smallest tremor, the sort that lives in a wrist that has held a needle too long, and it traveled up from the wrist into the pot and out through the spout, and one bright drop struck the saucer rather than the cup. And then the cup rocked, delicately, on its base, and then, slower than seemed possible, it began to tilt. She saw it tilt. She saw the room see it tilt. She saw Maurice's mouth begin the shape of a word that would strip the last usable thing from her, which was her welcome in her own father's house, and she saw Ilva's eyes brighten with the particular light of a person who has been handed a story she can dine on for a year. And she saw, in the corner of her vision, the Duke rise. He did not rise the way men rise in that house, which is to say slowly, as though standing were a favor. He rose the way a hinge opens. He was across the small distance before the cup had finished its tilt. He did not steady her hand. He did not touch her at all. He knelt, on one knee, on the good carpet, in the good coat, and he set his own hand beneath her cup, palm up, fingers loose, and he lifted it away from her, gently, the way a person lifts a wounded bird from a windowsill. The porcelain met his palm without a sound. He did not look at Maurice. He did not look at Ylva. He looked at the cup, and then, without hurry, he looked up at Rena, and his eyes were the composed gray of a lake in the hour before rain. "Please," he said, quite low. "Allow me." 2 words, and a courtesy that was not a courtesy at all, and the room understood, without being told, that something had just rearranged itself. For a heartbeat, no one moved. A log in the grate declined to comment. A footman by the door looked hard at a spot on the wall, the way footmen look at spots on walls when they wish very much to be somewhere else and know they will not be. Maurice recovered first. She had always been quick that way. Her voice arrived in the room like a well-set trap. "Your Grace," she said, with a laugh that was not a laugh. "Forgive the girl. She is not accustomed to such company." She reached, as she spoke, for the pot, in a gesture meant to demonstrate that competence had at last entered the scene. The Duke did not surrender the cup. He held it still, one knee on the carpet, and he tilted his head half an inch toward Maurice, and he said, with the mildness that in certain men is the last thing before a door closes forever, "She poured it perfectly. Madam, it was I who was unsteady." The word unsteady lay in the air, absurd, since he had not moved except deliberately, and everyone in the room heard the shape of the lie and understood, because he had used it plainly, that it was a courtesy extended to a stranger for a reason. Rena felt the borrowed dress grow strange on her shoulders. She was aware of her own breath, which had gone shallow, and of the pot in her right hand, which had begun, treacherously, to feel light. She set it down on the tray. She did not trust her voice, so she used none. Ylva laughed, a small, pretty laugh, and stepped forward. "Your Grace is too generous," she said. "My sister, my stepsister, has done her best. Do sit. Do drink. It is my favorite blend. I chose it myself." It was not her favorite blend. It was not chosen by her. It was chosen by Rena at 4 o'clock in the morning from the tea chest in the north pantry, because it was the blend a man of the Duke's line was said, in a letter written by his mother 11 years ago and filed under M for miscellaneous, to prefer in autumn. Rena had made that choice in the dark, kneeling on cold flagstones, because she had not been sure the Duke would be the one they expected, and she had wished, if he was not, that at least the tea would meet him honestly. He rose from the carpet. He did not rise the way he had knelt. He rose the way a man rises after a small private prayer, unhurried, and he carried the cup with him to the seat he had left, and he set it on the small table beside him without drinking, and he said to Miss Ylva, "And to the felicitations of the day, we shall attend in a moment. First, if the household will indulge me, I should like to know the name of the young woman who selected this blend." Maurice's smile hardened at the corners, the way ice hardens at the edges of a bowl. Ylva's laugh cooled by a degree. The footman by the door discovered a second, more interesting spot. Rena, who had for 7 years cultivated the ability to hear her own name spoken by strangers without flinching, discovered that her stepmother had never in that time said it aloud in company. Maurice said it now. "Rena," she said, and she said it as one says the name of a spoon. The Duke inclined his head. "Miss Rena," he said, and in his mouth the name acquired a small, unfamiliar dignity. He did not say anything else about her. He did not need to. He turned to Maurice with the pleasantness of a man discussing weather. "I trust," he said, "that arrangements for the signing will be tomorrow, as agreed by letter." Maurice said, "Of course, Your Grace." He said, "I shall look forward to it," and he sat, and he took up the cup, and he drank a mouthful of tea, and he did not compliment it. Because he was not a man who complimented obvious things, and Rena, standing 3 steps back from the table with her empty tray at her side, understood 2 things at once. The first was that he knew. About the tea, about the blend, about the letter under M for miscellaneous, and possibly about a great deal more. The second was that he had made, in the span of 30 seconds, an entirely quiet decision that had nothing to do with the betrothal being celebrated in that room. She did not know what the decision was. She did not, at that moment, wish to know. She wished only to be dismissed. Maurice dismissed her with a small, cold sweep of the hand, and Rena carried the tray from the parlor, with the tremor gone from her wrist, because a person who has just been seen by the wrong man, at the wrong moment, in the wrong dress, has no tremor to spare. In the corridor she paused. She set the tray on a side table. She pressed one palm flat against the cold plaster of the wall, and she counted, in her head, to 12, which was the number she had counted to as a child, on the night her father died, and her stepmother had told her, quite gently and without cruelty, that from this evening forward she would take her supper in the kitchen. She reached 12. She lifted the tray. She went on, downstairs, in the small room off the pantry that no one used for anything, and which she had, over the years, made into something like a study. Rena set the tray on the deal table and sat down, and did not, for a long moment, do anything at all. The room had a narrow window that looked onto the kitchen yard. There was a pigeon on the low wall. The pigeon considered her with the exact expression Maurice used when reviewing a household ledger. Rena considered the pigeon back. They agreed on a great many things. She had, in the top drawer of the deal table, a ledger of her own. It was not the household ledger, which Maurice believed she kept unaided, and which Rena had in fact balanced for 6 of the past 7 years. It was a smaller book, half the size, bound in brown cloth, and it contained things that would, if seen, have startled the household considerably. Names of correspondence, dates of letters received and sent, small, precise notes on obligations owed and obligations owing. She did not open it. She looked, instead, at the sleeve of the borrowed dress, which was a shade of blue that did not suit her and had been chosen for that reason, and she considered, without self-pity, the arithmetic of her position. She was 23. She had, in the house, no legal standing beyond her father's original testament, which had left the estate to her stepmother in trust for Ilva, and had provided for Rena a maintenance so modest that it functioned, in practice, as a leash. She had, in the world beyond the house, one aunt in a distant northern town who wrote once a year in a hand made illegible by rheumatism, and she had, in her possession, 17 coins of small denomination hidden in the spine of a book of sermons her father had loved and Maurice had never opened. That was the whole of her holdings, and now, in the parlor above her head, a duke who was not the duke they expected had knelt on the carpet and lifted her cup, and had said please, and had said her name, and had drunk her tea without praising it, and had asked a question about the signing tomorrow with the air of a man who had already decided something. She did not know what he had decided. She knew only that his kneeling had been, in that room, the loudest sound anyone had made in a year. She heard, above her, the muffled voices of the party continuing. Ilva laughing at something. Maurice laughing at something else. A man's low murmur, unhurried, and then, closer, the tread of small feet on the servants' stair, and the small feet resolving themselves into Petra, the housemaid, 7 years old in the eyes and 40 in the mouth, who had been sent to polish silver, and had evidently escaped, miss, said Petra from the doorway. Miss, he asked after you. Rena looked up. Who did? The tall one, said Petra. The one in the good coat. He asked Cook where the young woman had gone who chose the tea. Cook said she did not know. He said thank you. He did not go back into the parlor at once. He stood in the passage a moment. Then he went back. Petra delivered this information with the air of a general delivering intelligence to a superior officer. She had, over years of shared small kindnesses, come to regard Rena as her private cause. Rena considered her. Where is he now? In the parlor, said Petra. He is not drinking his tea. He has not touched it since the first sip. Miss Ilva is very lively. My aunt is very lively. He is listening. He is very good at listening. Rena said, thank you, Petra. Go and polish something visible. Petra grinned, the flash of a small conspiracy, and went. Rena sat a moment longer. Then she opened the drawer, and she took out the brown ledger, and she turned to the page she had marked 2 months ago with a strip of ribbon, and she read again, in her own careful hand, the entry she had made on the day the first letter arrived from the Duke's household proposing the match. She had made 3 entries that day. The first was the official one in the household ledger upstairs, recording the arrival of the letter and the seal upon it. The second was the private one in this book, noting a small discrepancy in the wording of the address. The letter had been directed to the mistress of the house at Aldenmore, and Aldenmore was not, and had never been, the name of the house. The house was called Aldemere. A person unfamiliar with the family might have made such an error, but the Duke's household was not unfamiliar. There had been correspondence, sporadic, for 2 generations. Someone in that household had written Aldenmore deliberately, or someone had written it who did not know the house at all, which was to say, someone had written it who was not from that household. The third entry, made in a smaller hand at the bottom of the page, and underlined once, said simply, check which cousin. She had checked. She had written a letter of her own to an old friend of her father's who kept a bookseller's shop in the capital, and who had, once in Rena's childhood, put a copy of a poem into her hand and said, remember who you are. The bookseller had written back in his slow, careful script on paper that smelt faintly of dust and lemon, and he had told her, gently and without emphasis, that the elder cousin who was said to be seeking a wife was in fact in the south of the country on a long convalescence and had been for 11 months, and that the younger cousin, who had lately inherited the title after the death of his uncle, was known to be quite unlike his brother in temperament and in taste, and that this younger cousin, though the world knew little of him, was said by those who did to be a person of unusual perception and of settled character. The bookseller had ended his letter by writing, with the smallest smile in the ink, be careful, my dear, when a wolf writes in the hand of a lamb. Rena had folded the letter and put it inside the sermons, beside the coins, and she had not shown it to anyone. She had not shown it because she did not know, yet, what it meant. She had known only that the man who arrived on the day of the betrothal would not be the man they were expecting, and that he would arrive with intentions of his own, and that Maurice and Ilva would treat him as the harmless elder and would proceed with the arrangement in ignorance, and that Rena, who could have corrected them, was not going to. It was not defiance, it was arithmetic. A woman who is a leash in a house does not cut the leash by shouting. She cuts it by knowing, on the day the door opens, who has come through it, and why. She closed the ledger. She put it away. She heard Maurice's voice, above, calling her name in the tone that meant come here at once, and she rose, and she smoothed the blue dress that did not suit her, and she went. The corridor to the parlor was long, and on the walls hung portraits of people to whom Rena was related, and by whom, in life, she would not have been acknowledged. She passed them without looking. At the door she paused, one hand on the brass, and she heard, through the wood, the Duke's voice, low, and Maurice's voice higher, and Ilva's higher still, and she did not, for one full breath, wish to go in. Then she went in. The Duke had risen. He stood by the window, half turned to the light, and he was holding a small object in his hand that Rena did not, at first, recognize. It was not from the parlor. It was not from any room in the house. He had brought it with him. It was a slim leather case, the size of a pair of gloves, and it was open, and inside it was a folded paper with a seal she knew by sight, because she had been the one, 7 years ago, at the age of 16, sitting alone in her father's study on the night of the funeral, who had gathered the papers from the desk before Maurice arrived with the executor. She had gathered them because her father had asked her, 3 days before he died, in a whisper she could still hear if the house was quiet enough, to make sure that Maurice never saw the ones with the green seal. She had not seen them since. She had assumed the executor had taken them. She had assumed, in the way one assumes when one is 16 and grieving and outnumbered, that they had gone the way all her father's things had gone, which was elsewhere, and away from her. The Duke held one of them now. He did not display it. He held it as though it were his own. He inclined his head to her as she entered. Maurice said, sharply, "Rena, His Grace requires the second tray." Rena did not move. She looked at the paper in the case. The Duke saw her looking. He closed the case gently and put it inside his coat. His eyes met hers, and in them she read, quite plainly, 3 things. The first was that he knew whose seal it was. The second was that he knew she knew. The third was that they would not in this room speak of it. He said, "Miss Rena, forgive me. I would be grateful if you might bring the second tray yourself. Cook will know which one." Maurice's smile pulled tight. Ilva's laugh went silent for one beat, and then resumed a note higher. Rena said, "Of course, Your Grace," and she curtsied without hurry, and she left the room. In the passage, out of sight, she leaned once against the wall. Then she went down to the kitchen. Cook was at the range and looked up. "There is no second tray," Cook said. "He said there was," said Rena. Cook considered her, then dried her hands slowly on her apron and said, "Then there is one now," and she began to set it. She used the plain china, because the plain china was Rena's and Cook's small private conspiracy, and she cut the bread thinner than Maurice would have permitted, and she set on the tray a jar of the pear preserve that Maurice believed had been used up in the spring, and that Cook had in fact hidden behind the flour bin for reasons only Cook understood. Cook said, without looking up, "Is he a decent one?" Rena said, "I do not yet know." Cook said, "He asked me a question in the passage. He asked whether the young woman who chose the tea was well treated in this house. I said the young woman was as well treated as this house treats anyone. He said, 'Thank you,' and he did not press. I thought you should know." Rena said, "Thank you," and she took the tray. At the foot of the servant's stair, she paused a second time. She thought of the paper with the green seal. She thought of her father's whisper. She thought of the 17 coins in the spine of the sermons. She thought of the pigeon on the wall, which had looked at her with such settled judgment. She climbed the stair. He was standing by the window still when she returned, and he did not turn at once. Maurice had, in her absence, moved the arrangement of the room so that Ilva sat closer to the Duke, and Rena would, in setting down the tray, be obliged to pass behind her stepsister's chair, which was a small choreography of humiliation Maurice had perfected over years. Rena set the tray down without passing behind the chair. She set it on the low table on the Duke's side of the room, which was closer to the window. And she did this because she had decided, in the passage, that she was tired. Not of Maurice, exactly, whose cruelties were by now as familiar as her own handwriting, but of the shape of herself when Maurice was watching. She was tired of the shape. She set the tray down. She did not look at Ylva. She looked at the Duke. He turned from the window. He did not smile. He inclined his head half an inch, which in him she was beginning to understand was the equivalent of another man's warm greeting. He said, "Thank you, Miss Rena," and he said it in a tone that was neither warmer nor cooler than the tone he had used to Maurice, and yet the difference was audible to everyone in the room, because it was the tone of a person addressing an equal. Ylva said, brightly, "Do sit with us, sister. You have been busy all morning." It was a trap. If Rena sat, Maurice would find a task for her within 30 seconds that would remove her from the room in disgrace. If she refused, she would be sullen. Rena took the third seat, which was the smallest, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she said, "Thank you, Ylva," and she waited. The Duke sat. He looked at the fresh tray. He looked at the pear preserve, which was the color of amber and which he had, quite certainly, not been expecting. He looked at Rena. "Miss Rena," he said, "do you take preserve with your bread?" Maurice's fan opened with a snap. "I take it when it is offered," Rena said, which was not the answer of a stepdaughter, and was not quite the answer of a servant, and it hovered in the air a moment, and the Duke received it with a small, contained expression that on a less controlled face would have been a smile. "Then it is offered," he said, and he spread a piece for her, himself, on a small plate, and he passed it to her across the table, and Maurice's fan opened wider, and Ylva laughed, and the laugh was a thin, brittle sound this time, because Ylva, who was not clever, but who was not stupid, had begun to understand that the shape of the afternoon was not the shape she had been promised. Maurice recovered, as she always recovered, and steered the talk toward the settlement, which she had, evidently, decided to negotiate publicly in order to demonstrate to the Duke the seriousness of the family's expectations. She spoke of Ylva's portion. She spoke of the joining of estates. She spoke, with a delicate cough, of certain understandings regarding the elder Aldemir lands, which had, she said, been long held in a private trust that would, upon the marriage, revert to the joined household. The Duke listened. He did not interrupt. He drank one mouthful of tea. He set the cup down. He said, "Madam, forgive me. I fear there has been a small confusion of persons. I am not my cousin." There was a silence in the room that had weight. It was not a shocked silence. It was the silence of a household whose scaffolding has, in one sentence, been demonstrated to be resting on the wrong beam. Maurice said, "Your Grace." He said, "My cousin is in the south, and has been for some time. He is not seeking a wife. He will not be seeking a wife this season, or any season, I fear. The title has come to me." He said this without triumph, as one names a fact. Ylva said, "But the letters." "The letters were correctly written," said the Duke, gently. "They were written by me. I signed them in the name of the house, as is my right, and I did not correct the assumption in your reply, because I wished to see this household as it is, and not as it dresses for a visitor." Maurice's mouth had gone very small, and now, said the Duke, having seen it, I find myself with two matters to address. The first is the settlement, which will not proceed on the terms you have described, because the elder Aldemir lands are not in a private trust. They are held, under my late uncle's testament, in the direct guardianship of the surviving daughter of the previous master of this house. And that, madam, is not Miss Ylva. He did not look at Rena as he said it. He was too courteous a man to point. But every other person in the room looked at her, and Rena, for the first time in 7 years, did not look at the carpet. She looked at Maurice. Maurice looked back. And in Maurice's eyes, for one bare instant before the mask returned, Rena saw the truth she had suspected since she was 16, which was that her stepmother had always known. Ylva said, in a small, uncomprehending voice, "The lands are Rena's." The Duke said, "Miss Ylva, forgive me. The lands are Miss Rena's, and have been since the day her father died. What has happened in this house since that day is a matter I intend, with her permission, to look into." He turned to Rena. He did not kneel this time. He simply turned. "Miss Rena," he said, "may I have your permission?" She could not at once speak. She nodded. He inclined his head. "Thank you," he said. "And now, madam," he said to Maurice, "the second matter." He drew from his coat the leather case. He set it on the table between them. He did not open it. Maurice looked at the case as one looks at a snake that has, unexpectedly, appeared in one's own kitchen. "The second matter," said the Duke, "is a document with a green seal, of which several were removed from this house on the night of the funeral 7 years ago, and which came, by paths I shall be pleased to explain in the proper venue, into my late uncle's possession, and thereafter into mine. They concern, madam, certain undertakings you gave, in writing, to certain persons in exchange for certain considerations, in the year before the master of this house died. I do not think you would wish these papers read here today. I think you would prefer to read them, first, in private, with me." Maurice said nothing. The Duke said, gently, "Madam, I am not your enemy. I am a stranger who has come, this afternoon, to attend a betrothal. I find the betrothal cannot proceed as planned. That is a matter for Miss Ylva and me to discuss in due course, and I will not shame her in this room. But the household must be set right." He looked, finally, at Ylva. "Miss Ylva," he said, "I hope you will forgive me the deception of the letters. I did not come here to make you unhappy. I came, I confess, to see with my own eyes what had become of a family this house owed a debt to. I will not marry you. I will not marry anyone under these terms. If, when the dust of this afternoon settles, we find we might know one another honestly, that will be a matter for another day. I do not wish to injure you." Ylva did not cry. She had been raised by Maurice to consider crying a form of failure. She looked at her mother. Her mother did not look back. And Ylva, in that moment, understood something about her mother that she had not, in 20 years, understood, and her face did a small, unnameable thing, and she said, quite steadily, "Thank you, Your Grace. I think I should like some air." She rose. She left the room. She did not slam the door. She closed it with the care of a person who intends, in some later hour, to open a great many doors on her own account. They sat then, the three of them, in a room that had, in one afternoon, been rearranged down to its foundations. The clock on the mantel spoke twice, softly. A single log in the grate collapsed into itself with the sigh of an argument abandoned. The Duke did not move. Maurice did not move. Rena, who had for 7 years measured her survival in inches of stillness, held her hands in her lap and did not move either. Then Maurice said, quite low, "What do you want?" It was not a question a woman like Maurice should have needed to ask. It was the question of a woman who has, at last, put down a weapon she has grown too tired to lift. The Duke did not answer at once. He looked at Rena. He said, "That is not for me to say. It is for Miss Rena. There is nothing in that case that will be read to any court or to any relation without her word, and there is no rearrangement of this household that will be made without her word." He said this in the tone of a man stating the position of the sun. It was not gallantry. It was arithmetic. Rena looked at the case on the table. She looked at Maurice. She looked, longest, at the small object she could not quite see beyond Maurice, which was a portrait of her father as a younger man, hung crookedly over the mantel because Maurice had never troubled to straighten it. She said, "I do not want the papers read." Maurice's shoulders, which had not moved a fraction. "I do not want the papers read," Rena said again, "because I have no wish to spend my life recounting what was done. But I want, from this hour, the household ledger. I want the keys. I want the north pantry, and the study, and the letters as they arrive. I want Petra out of the polishing room and back with Cook where she was engaged to be. I want Ilva, if she chooses to remain in this house, to remain as my sister, and not as a person set against me. And I want you, madam, to take, if you wish, the small estate at Marin, which was your own before you married my father, and which is unencumbered and will support you well, and to remove yourself to it." She said all this without heat, because she had rehearsed none of it, and there was therefore no rehearsal to fail. Maurice listened. When Rena had finished, Maurice said, "And if I do not?" Rena said, "Then the papers will be read. I do not wish it. But I will not spend another winter in this house with you as its mistress. Choose." Maurice looked at her a long time. She looked, Rena thought, at a person she had not, in 7 years, taken the trouble to see. Then she said, "I will go to Marin." She rose. She did not curtsy to the Duke, and he did not require it. She walked to the door. At the door she paused. She said, without turning, "Your father, at the end, was afraid you would not survive me." She said it as one delivers a message one has been asked, long ago, to deliver, and then forgotten, and then, in an ambush of memory, remembered too late. Then she went out. The room was very quiet. The Duke did not speak. Rena sat, and after some time she found that she was breathing more easily than she had breathed in 7 years, and that this ease was not joy, but the absence of a weight she had not, until that moment, permitted herself to feel. She looked at the Duke. He was watching her, not intrusively, the way one watches the surface of a pond that has, at last, gone still. She said, "Why did you kneel?" He considered the question. He said, "Because you were about to drop the cup, and no one else in the room was going to catch it." "That," said Rena, "is not the reason." He almost smiled. "No," he said, "it is not the whole reason. The whole reason is that I have been reading letters, Miss Rena, for 11 months, some in a hand I did not know, and some in a hand I did. The hand I did not know balanced the household ledgers of a house not its own, and did so with a care that bordered on tenderness. The hand I did know wrote, once, a small note in the margin of a bookseller's letter about a poem your father had loved." He paused. "When I saw your wrist tremble in that room," he said, "I understood I had been reading, all this time, the same hand, and I could not then let the cup fall." Rena, who had not wept in the parlor, and had not wept in the corridor, and had not wept when Maurice spoke of her father, wept then, quietly, once, one tear that fell into the palm she had opened without meaning to. She did not apologize for it. He did not remark on it. He rose. He said, "I will leave you now. There is a great deal to be done, and none of it must be done today. I will come again, if I may, in a week. I will come, if I may, without the leather case, and without any question of settlements, and we will walk in the garden, and you will tell me, if you wish, which poem your father loved," she said. "That would be welcome." He bowed. At the door he paused. "Miss Rena," he said, "I do not know what your life will be. I hope, only, that from this hour it is yours." Then he was gone. Rena sat alone in the parlor for a long time. The pigeon returned to the low wall. The clock spoke again, softly. The tea in the pot had gone cold. She rose, at last, and she carried the pot to the kitchen herself, because there was no one now in the house whose task it was more properly than hers. In the kitchen, Cook looked at her once and then away, and set out 2 clean cups without a word. Petra came in from the yard with a smudge on her cheek. Ilva came down, later, in a plain dress, and sat at the deal table and did not speak for an hour, and then said, "Sister," and Rena said, "Sister," and they sat together in the low light, and it broke quietly, whatever had been between them, and something smaller and truer took its place. In the weeks that followed, the world outside the house rearranged itself around the new arithmetic. Maurice departed for Marin on a bright morning with 3 trunks and a maid, and she did not turn at the gate, and Rena did not stand at the window to watch her go, because she found she did not need to. A letter arrived some days later from the estate at Marin, which said in Maurice's small hand that the roof leaked in the west wing and that she would attend to it. And it said nothing else, and Rena answered it in her own small hand with a note that said only that she was glad to hear of the roof. They wrote, after that, a few times a year about roofs and hedges and the small ailments of horses, and never about anything else, and it was, in its way, a peace. Ilva remained in the house for a season, and then, of her own choosing, took a small allowance and went to live with an aunt in a market town where she was not known, and there she astonished her family, and herself, by learning bookkeeping from a widow in the next street, and by opening, within a year, a small subscription library that grew, in 3 years, into a modestly celebrated one. She wrote to Rena every fortnight. Her letters were dry and observant and, in time, funny. She never married the Duke's cousin. She married, eventually, a printer of quiet habits and radical opinions who made her laugh at breakfast, which was, Ilva wrote, a thing she had not been aware until him could be done. Cook stayed. Cook would have stayed if the house had been carried off by a river. Petra, who was 7 at the time of the tea and was 17 when this story ends, grew into a tall, competent girl who ran, at last, the north pantry with an iron hand and a soft heart, and who married a blacksmith from 3 villages away, and who named her first daughter Rena, and her second daughter Ilva, and her third daughter, in a fit of dry humor, Maurice, because, she said, one ought to know the shape of what one has escaped. The bookseller in the capital lived long enough to see the poem he had once put into a girl's hand read aloud, at a small gathering, by a woman who had grown into her own name, and he died contented and left her his shop, and she kept it, and she read, on winter evenings, at the desk where he had written to her the letter about wolves in the hands of lambs. And the Duke. The Duke came in a week, as he had said, without the leather case, and they walked in the garden, which was overgrown, and Rena told him which poem her father had loved, and he did not know it, and asked her to read it to him, and she did, and he listened. And when she had finished, he did not say anything for a while, and then he said, "Thank you, Miss Rena," and they walked on. They walked, in that garden and in others, for a year. He did not press, she did not hurry. They agreed on a great many things, and disagreed, gently, on a few, and one evening in a garden by a river he asked her, quite simply, if she would marry him, and she said, quite simply, yes, and they were married in a small chapel in a small town, with Ilva and the printer and cook and Petra and the bookseller's widow in the pews, and no one else, and after the ceremony they walked back to the inn on foot, because the evening was fine, and because they had, both of them, walked to a great many things on foot, and saw no reason to change. They lived, together, a life of the kind that does not make good chronicles, because nothing in it exploded, and nothing in it burned, and no one in it was thrown from a horse. They had 2 children, one of each, and Rena, who had for so long been unseen, was seen, at last, every day, by a man who had learned very young to notice small things, and she saw him, in return, and they grew old together in a house that was, at last, called by its right name. And on the mantel in that house, over the fire, hung a portrait of a man who had once whispered to a daughter, 3 days before he died, to protect certain papers with a green seal, and the portrait, at Rena's insistence, was always hung straight. And now, my dear one, I see the fire has burned low, and the hour is late, and your tea, if you have any, will be cold, and it is time we let this story rest. If you have ever poured a cup for a room that did not deserve you, and steadied your wrist as best you could, and felt the porcelain betray you when you were closest to the end, then you already know the shape of Rena's afternoon, and you know, too, that sometimes the person who kneels is not the one you expected, and sometimes the smallest gesture made in the exact right second undoes a knot that has been pulled tight for years. Tell me, before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the cup, when it tilted? Was it the word please? Was it the door Ilva closed with such care? Was it Maurice at the gate, not turning? Was it the tear that fell into an opened palm without permission? Sit with me here a little longer, by this small fire, and if you would like another story on another evening, come back to this quiet hearth of ours, whatever name you have given it in your own heart, and pull up your chair, and I will have the kettle on, and there will be another cup, and another life, and another gentle undoing of a knot pulled tight too long. Until then, my dear one, rest easy, and be gentle with your own trembling hands, and know that you are, at this hour, and in this small circle of firelight, seen. Good night.